Chapter 5. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she displayed it to him. "Do you like this shirt with this suit?" she asked him. Or, "Would you like to wear your black derby? You look very handsome in it. Shall we pack it?" And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward and Abilene and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock. On her head she wore a floppy hat strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. "Goodbye," Abilene shouted to her grandmother. "I love you." The ship pulled away from the dock. Pellegrina waved to Abilene. "Goodbye, lady," she called. "Goodbye." Edward felt something damp in his ears. Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkling clothing. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved to see the last of her. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention on board the ship. "What a singular rabbit!" said an elderly lady with 3 strings of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances full of longing. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. "No," said Abilene, "I'm afraid that he's not the kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." 2 young boys, brothers named Martin and Amos, took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long legs stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," said Abilene. "Does he wind up somewhere?" asked Amos. "No," said Abilene, "he does not wind up." "What's the point of him, then?" said Martin. "The point is that he is Edward," said Abilene. "That's not much of a point," said Amos. "It's not," agreed Martin. And then after a long, thoughtful pause, he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me neither," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits, and he has his own pajamas, too. They're made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing in off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite dashing. It came as a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf, and then his jacket and pants were ripped from his body. He heard his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship, and then, held upside down, he watched the watch roll merrily toward Abilene's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got underwear." He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No!" screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear. Edward was paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassing glances his way. "Give him to me!" screamed Abilene. "He's mine!" "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Please," cried Abilene. "Don't throw him. He's made of china. He'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could happen to him. But he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed, in the same naked state, from the hands of one grubby laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back," called Martin. Amos raised his arm, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Aibileen tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. So it was that Edward did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. Chapter 6. How does a China rabbit die? Can a China rabbit drown? Is my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing out over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long way away, Edward heard Aibileen call his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Come back!" Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled, ears over tail through the air, he managed to catch one last glimpse of Aibileen. He sank and sank and sank. She was standing on the deck of the ship, holding onto the railing with one hand. In her other hand was a lamp. No, it was a ball of fire. No, Edward realized it was his gold pocket watch that Aibileen held in her hand. She was holding it up high, and it was reflecting the light of the sun. My pocket watch, he thought. I need that. And then Aibileen disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force that his hat blew off his head. That answers that question, thought Edward as he watched the hat dance away in the wind. And then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. He kept his eyes open the whole time, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. His painted-on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green, and then to blue again. They watched as it finally became as black as night. Edward went down and down. He said to himself, "If I am going to drown, certainly I would have done so by now." Far above him, the ocean liner, with Aibileen aboard it, sailed blithely on, and the China rabbit landed, finally, on the ocean floor, face down, and there, with his head in the muck, he experienced his first genuine and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid. Chapter 7. He told himself that certainly Aibileen would come and find him. This, Edward thought, is much like waiting for Aibileen to come home from school. I will pretend that I am in the dining room of the house on Egypt Street, waiting for the little hand to move to 3 and the big hand to land on 12. If only I had my watch, then I would know for sure. But it doesn't matter. She will be here soon, very soon. Hours passed, and then days, and weeks, and months. Aibileen did not come. Edward, for lack of anything better to do, began to think. He thought about the stars. He remembered what they looked like from his bedroom window. What made them shine so brightly, he wondered? And were they still shining somewhere, even though he could not see them? Never in my life, he thought, have I been farther away from the stars than I am now. He considered, too, the fate of the beautiful princess who had become a warthog. Why had she become a warthog? Because the ugly witch turned her into one? That was why. And then the rabbit thought about Pellegrina. He felt in some way that he could not explain to himself that she was responsible for what had happened to him. It was almost as if it was she and not the boys who had thrown Edward overboard. She was like the witch in the story. No, she was the witch in the story. True, she did not turn him into a warthog, but just the same she was punishing him, although for what he could not say. On the 297th day of Edward's ordeal, a storm came. The storm was so powerful that it lifted Edward off the ocean floor and led him in a crazy, wild, and spinning dance. The water pummeled him and lifted him up and shoved him back down. Help! thought Edward. The storm, in its ferocity, actually flung him all the way out of the sea, and the rabbit glimpsed for a moment the light of an angry and bruised sky. The wind rushed through his ears. It sounded to him like Pellegrina laughing, but before he had time to appreciate being above water, he was tossed back down into the depths. Up and down, back and forth he went until the storm wore itself out, and Edward saw that he was beginning again his slow descent to the ocean floor. "Oh, help me," he thought. "I can't go back there. Help me." But still down he went, down, down, down. And then suddenly a great wide net of a fisherman reached out and grabbed the rabbit. The net lifted him higher and higher until there was an almost unbearable explosion of light, and Edward was back in the world, lying on the deck of a ship, surrounded by fish. "Hey, what's that?" said a voice. "Ain't no fish," said another voice, "that's for sure." The light was so brilliant that it was hard for Edward to see, but finally shapes appeared out of the light, and then faces. And Edward realized that he was looking up at two men, one young and one old. "Looks like some toy," said the grizzled old man. He bent and picked Edward up and held him by his front paws, considering him. "A rabbit, I reckon. It's got whiskers and rabbit ears, or the shape of rabbit ears, I guess. At least, yeah, sure, a rabbit toy," said the younger man, and he turned away. "I'll take it home to Nellie. Let her fix it up and set it to rights. Give it to some child." The old man placed Edward carefully on a crate, positioning him so that he was sitting up and could look out at the sea. Edward appreciated the courtesy of this small gesture, but he was heartily sick of the ocean and would have been satisfied never to set eyes on it again. "There you go," said the old man. As they made their way back to shore, Edward felt the sun on his face and the wind blowing through the little bit of fur left on his ears. And something filled his chest, a wonderful feeling. He was glad to be alive. "Look at that rabbit," the old man said. "Looks like it's enjoying the ride, don't it?" Yep," said the young man. In fact, Edward Tulane was so happy to be back among the living that he did not even take umbrage at being referred to as it. Chapter 8. On land, the old fisherman stopped to light a pipe, and then with the pipe clenched between his teeth he walked home, carrying Edward atop his left shoulder as he were a conquering hero. The fisherman balanced him there, placing a calloused hand at Edward's back. He talked to him in a soft, low voice as they walked. "You'll like Nellie, you will," said the old man. "She's had her sadness, but she's an all-right girl." Edward looked at the small town blanketed in dusk, a jumble of buildings huddled together, the ocean stretching out in front of it all, and he thought that he would like anything and anybody that was not at the bottom of the sea. "Hello, Lawrence," called a woman from the front of a shop. "What have you got?" "Fresh catch," said the fisherman. "Fresh rabbit from the sea." He lifted his cap to the lady and kept walking. "There you are now," said the fisherman. He took the pipe out of his mouth and pointed with the stem of it at a star in the purpling sky. "There's your North Star right there. Don't you never have to be lost when you know where that fellow is." Edward considered the brightness of the small star. "Do they all have names?" he wondered. "Listen at me," said the fisherman. "Talking to a toy. Oh, well, here we are then." And with Edward still on his shoulder, the fisherman walked up a stone-lined path and into a little green house. "Look here, Nellie," he said. "I've brought you something from the sea." "I don't want nothing from the sea," came a voice. "Aw, now, don't be like that, Nell. Come and see, then." An old woman stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. When she saw Edward, she dropped the apron and clapped her hands together and said, "Oh, Lawrence, you brought me a rabbit?" "Direct from the sea," said Lawrence. He took Edward off his shoulder and stood him up on the floor and held on to his hands and made him take a deep bow in the direction of Nellie. "Oh," said Nellie, "here." She clapped her hands together again, and Lawrence passed Edward to her. Nellie held the rabbit out in front of her and looked him over from tip to toe. She smiled. "She's beautiful," breathed Nellie. "Have you ever in your life seen anything so fine?" she said. Edward felt immediately that Nellie was a very discerning woman. She's beautiful, breathed Nellie. For a moment, Edward was confused. Was there some other object of beauty in the room? What will I call her? Susanna, said Lawrence. Just right, said Nellie. Susanna. She looked deep into Edward's eyes. First off, Susanna will need some clothes, won't she?